Since protesters first began calling out Israel's attacks on Gaza after the brutal Hamas terror attacks on October 7th, there's been a lot of debate and outrage over some of the language they've been using. And as the protests have grown in response to the rising death toll in Gaza, over 35,000 Palestinians, tensions over these messages are continuing to build. To help us break down the outrage and what protesters do and don't mean when they say from the river to the sea, I'm joined now by Abdallah Fayyad, policy correspondent for Vox and former member of the Boston Globe's editorial board, and also Robert Pape, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Thank you both for being here. So, Robert, the seed of the idea for this conversation that we're hoping to have was planted by that big survey you did on how college students are being affected by the protests on both sides on college campuses in recent months. Can you just briefly summarize what you found in that huge survey you did?
So we did a large survey published just about a month before this most recent escalation, over 5,000 college students from over 600 institutions. And we discovered there's a tragic misunderstanding. And this is something that we can do something about without suppressing speech, without suppressing protests. And it will do a lot to calm campus fears. What's that tragic misunderstanding? We asked people not to name the river and the sea. We did that too, but we asked more importantly, what do they think that phrase means? And it turns out that about a quarter of the students think that phrase means genocide and expulsion of Israeli Jews. But that, for Jewish students, is 66%. Of those students think it means the genocide expulsion of Israeli Jews, but only 14% of Muslim students think that phrase means that. In fact, most Muslim students think it means a two-state solution. So what that means is that if we can distribute that knowledge, if we can show people that there are different intents, different messages coming from the same words, this can help us to have some protesters perhaps self-restrain, other protesters explain they really mean the two-state solution. And what this would do is offer a way to calm campus fears by dispelling this tragic misunderstanding that's causing so many to be so fearful on campus.
I hear you saying that you envision, based on those findings, possibly some pro-Palestinian protesters adjusting their message, but also possibly some supporters of Israel explaining to people who view the conflict the way they do, no, in fact, this call that we've heard throughout the protest doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does. So it sounds like you're talking about both sides doing a bit of work there.
This is a tragic misunderstanding happening on both sides, and that's why this information is so vital to bring to all college campuses.
I apologize. I just want to make sure to get Abdallah in here. So Abdallah, I'd like to get your thoughts as someone who's covered the campus protests on whether you have seen the sort of gulfs in understanding or mutual miscomprehension that Robert just mentioned, and also the extent to which you think when it comes to mottos or creeds recited by people who support a given movement, the extent to which they might be held responsible for perceptions on the other side of what they're saying.
Yeah, so one of the issues here is, I would say, not just what Robert says, though I think that's a big part of the story, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what these phrases mean. But I think it goes beyond just misunderstanding. For the last 76 years, the charge of anti-Semitism has been used to suppress pro-Palestinian activism and to suppress pro-Palestinian speech. It's not just a matter of how people protest, because time and again, Palestinians are told, you shouldn't protest this way, you shouldn't protest that way, that's offensive in this way. If you boycott, that's anti-Semitic. If you disrupt, that's anti-Semitic. If you divest, that's anti-Semitic. And so over the years, the goalposts keep moving as to what is acceptable speech in pro-Palestinian circles and what isn't. And this is no different. What we've seen crop up on campuses across the country is oftentimes an exaggeration of chants that are made, sometimes an entire fabrication that makes its way through to mainstream stories. As Jewish Currents reported a few weeks ago, there was, earlier on chants at UCLA, chants at UPenn, for example, that people said were quote unquote chants for Jewish genocide. When that was later investigated, that was seen that was discovered to be a chant that said, "We charge you with genocide with respect to Israel."
And we saw something similar happen.
Part of the story as well.
Something similar happened at Northeastern University here, where chants that were cited as the pretext for shutting down that that encampment turned out to have come from pro-Israel protesters who were basically looking to incite. Robert, I'd like to ask you to talk about the connection between criticism of Israel on the one hand and charges of anti-Semitism on the other. Before I do that, I want to note that you have offered a pretty, to my mind, damning assessment of what Israel has been doing in Gaza. You called it, speaking with the Associated Press, one of the most intense civilian punishment campaigns in history. You said it now sits comfortably in the top quartile of the most devastating bombing campaigns ever. So I put that out there as context because I also want to note that as you have looked into what constitutes anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic speech or acts, am I correct that you include criticism of Israel in that broader umbrella of what can be taken as anti-Semitism?
Yes. Let me just make two quick points. Number one, you're quite right that I've written pieces. In fact, I've written the earliest pieces explaining why Israel's strategy in Gaza was doomed to fail to destroy Hamas. So not just the piece you quoted, but even a piece a month before that. So I've not just been part of a crowd, I've been a leader in explaining that. And that's something that comes from the fact that I have been studying political violence for 30 years. So I'm not a professor that's come to the issue of political violence lately. I've been doing this for 30 years, and that's why I'm also focusing now on what's happening on college campuses. But now to directly answer your question about, yes, we measured anti-Semitism 3 different ways. So we measure it the way the ADL measures it, with support for anti-Jewish tropes, that is anti-Semitism meaning prejudice for Jews as a people. We measured it with violence in particular. Do you support, or when Jews are violently attacked, do they deserve it? So a hard edge question about supporting violence against Jews. And then third, we measure it negative views of Israel. And what we discovered is this is a very interesting academic debate, but when you support any of those 3, you're much more likely to blame American Jews for the violence that's happening overseas between Israel and Palestine. So although this is an interesting academic debate, and I'm an academic, I like those, in reality, the Jews who are being targeted, they can be targeted as either being Jewish or a symbol of Israel, but that still makes them a target.
I found myself wondering, another suggestion that I know you have floated is that when people are engaged in pro-Palestinian protests that is critical of Israel and Israel's actions, that they find some way of conveying that they don't blame American Jews for Israel's actions. When I encountered that idea of yours, I thought to myself, well, to some extent, I would think that that is implicit in the participation of so many American Jews in the pro-Palestinian movement. But Abdallah, I want to ask you, we've talked about a couple possible concessions that Robert has suggested could be made on the pro-Palestinian side, broadly speaking. Are there things that you think supporters of Israel could be doing differently, ways they could be messaging differently in a manner that is more constructive as this movement, or I should say these movements, continue? Because we're breaking for the summer now, but it may continue through the summer, and we may be back at it again in the fall on college campuses. Would you like to see supporters of Israel say or do things differently?
I mean, I think chief among them is this conflation of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism and the bad faith arguments against student protesters and Palestinians more broadly as being inherently anti-Semitic in their criticism of Israel. I think that's a very dangerous trope about Palestinians, that we are so fundamentally anti-Semitic that we're incapable of expressing our desire for freedom without implying some way or another our desire, or our hatred of the Jewish people. And that's just, to me, fundamentally this racist perception of Palestinians. And that's what plagues a lot of these protests and why you might see such a quick and swift police response, such an aggressive police response when pro-Palestinian students assemble on college campuses in the U.S. in ways that you don't see for other causes. There is this conflation with the cause of Palestinian freedom with anti-Semitism, and I think a lot of that is bad faith. So supporters of Israel who are trying to debate in good faith have to rid themselves of the notion that any criticism of Israel, including really uncomfortable truths, is inherently anti-Semitic, especially as we are talking about a bombing campaign that has now killed over 35,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and just the sheer devastation, the humanitarian crisis that Palestinians are facing today.
I want to throw one more question at you, Robert, and we don't have a ton of time to get into it. We could talk about this for a long time. We'll have about a minute, but there's a bigger philosophical question, I think, behind everything that we've been discussing here, which is what are protest slogans and protests themselves for? Are they about affecting concrete change? Are they about giving the purest possible voice to rage and grief that people feel? Are they about convincing the other side, maintaining a civil environment in a place, in a context like a college or university campus? Robert, I wonder if you think that if the concessions that you think could be made by pro-Palestinian protesters were made, do you think they'd be more likely to get a sympathetic audience to, for example, their calls for divestment from Israel?
I do. I actually think that's right. So I think what's happening right now is that the protesters are actually not being that successful. Even the biggest concessions are teeny tiny concessions that you're seeing, and we're not seeing a single university make a major divestment of any kind.
Not yet,
And I think that a part of the reason is it splits the movement, so that what you see is the pro-Palestinian, in our surveys, we see that the part of the pro-Palestinian protesters, only a tiny fraction actually support Hamas, yet it's easy to paint them all as pro-Hamas.
To your point, Abdallah.
This is the exact point he's making. But the real solution here is not suppressing speech. It's actually giving more informed future speech with research like the kind we're doing. So notice that what Abdallah said is everybody's making these assumptions. Our research isn't making assumptions. We have highly granular data, and this is very important, and we're having a great conversation right now about it. If we could have this conversation happening more widely around the country, this would be beginning a process of calm that could not end everything with this, but it could start a calming process overall.
This is just a hunch. I think Abdallah may have been talking about those of us in the media, broadly speaking, when it comes to making assumptions. Abdallah, am I right there?
I mean, the one thing that I would say here is, and that I would add, is that when I talk about kind of bad faith charges of anti-Semitism about pro-Palestinians, I would just ask us, especially, yes, in the media, to ask ourselves why we don't respond to real charges of anti-Semitism against Donald Trump and how he talks about American Jews when he supports Israel and says if they don't vote for him, that
the dual loyalty trope,
stupid,
yep.
or whatever it is.
Great question.
And those don't even register as a blip on some publications' radar to make it to the front page in the same way that what a random student on a college campus may have said here or there. And so I really think we should rethink our priorities when we talk about really dangerous bigotry, whoever it's directed at.
All right. On that note, Robert Pape, Abdallah Fayyad, thank you both for talking this very delicate and tricky stuff through. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us on.